Hello friends, welcome. Friends, one of my viewers requested me to make a video on unlicensed frequencies in India and its limitation. Now, I thought that this is a very good opportunity to do a tutorial on licensed spectrum versus unlicensed spectrum and administered spectrum. Because spectrum can be pretty confusing. People generally do not have a very good understanding of spectrum. And therefore, because of lack of understanding of spectrum, many things about services, mobile services, their limitations, their advantages, all these are misunderstood, right? So this video, which I am going to do today, is going to give you a very good clarity in layman terms. Why spectrum is licensed? What are the advantages of licensed spectrum? Why some spectrum are unlicensed? What are the advantages and disadvantages of unlicensed spectrum? And why certain spectrum is given administratively? Why those spectrum are not auctioned? What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of those spectrum? For example, satellite spectrum is given administratively. It is not auctioned, though people have been shouting at the top of the voice that satellite spectrum should be also auctioned, right? Because if you recall, Devas was a scam, and then we are still fighting in the battle in the court of law. Indian government is still struggling in the court of law to bail themselves out about the huge fine, right? So that gave a perception that satellite spectrum should also be auctioned, right? So this video is going to give you a very good insight, friends, and without any technical jargons. I'm not going to use any technical jargons, and be with me and you will understand everything about spectrum in just one video, 20 minutes. Okay, just be focused. So friends, I started with a diagram, and I will make it very simple, friends. Don't get overwhelmed with my diagrams, right? Because sometimes I'm not a very good artist, but I'll try to explain to you what I have drawn here and what is the purpose of this drawing. So this gives a kind of a sketch of a licensed spectrum being utilized by deploying some BTSs. Now friends, when you give licensed spectrum like IMT spectrum, auction it, what is the purpose? Let's understand what is the purpose of auctioning and giving spectrum to an entity in a licensed form. Means that spectrum is going to be used by only that entity who has paid for that spectrum, nobody else. There cannot be any interference, there cannot be any kind of intrusion in that spectrum by anybody else. That's the whole purpose. It cannot be 100% perfect, but this is more or less licensed spectrum is like, which means that you have got a spectrum block of X megahertz, right? So that spectrum is auctioned to you, you paid for it. Now, what is the purpose of that licensed entity, the operator? That operator whole purpose and objective is to harness as much capacity from this X megahertz spectrum so that he can serve its customers, right? Because if the spectrum cannot be harnessed fully with all kind of capacity, means throughput, data capability, then the purpose of paying for the spectrum is of no use, right? That is the whole objective. So what it does, he puts base station. Now this base station, if you see this base station, this is just a network, right? But these base stations are put in a very intelligent fashion. What does it mean? It basically means that these base station, radius of this base station, right, are determined by the network planner. He has to decide what will be the radius of coverage of this base station, because these are deliberately designed for a certain coverage. It's not that you put a base station and it can cover whatever area it kind of is capable of. You just blast it out. It's not like that, right? So this area is designed in order to cover a certain population group. Means in this, let's say in this particular area, you have got a large population group, right? This whole area, let me just show you this whole area, not this particular base station, this whole area. You have got a very large population group. Then what you will do, you will make these base station coverages as small as possible, right? And you will have multiple of these base station in this whole area to cover that population density, because your quantum of spectrum is limited. So if you can multiply this quantum of spectrum by having n number of BTSs and by reducing the coverage of the BTSs in a smaller size, then what will happen? You will be able to serve all that customer, and this is called capacity sites. Capacity site means that even the base station is capable of driving a large distance, you deliberately restrict the base station coverage to a small area to able to drive a large population density. Now, let's say this area doesn't have that much of population, right? It is a sparsely populated area. Then what you are going to do? You are going to drive the capacity of the base station, or the coverage of the base station to as much as possible, because then it becomes a coverage site. Because you want to have coverage. Your aim is to have coverage because these base stations are not going to be fully utilized. Whereas in case of capacity, the base stations are fully utilized. Means there are no capacity left. Here, these are called coverage sites then, right? So these are the two ways you can create a network. And that's how licensed spectrum with full flexibility, you can create a network which will be able to harness the full capacity of the spectrum, and that depends upon your demographic. So that is the objective, to harness, and because there are no interference, nothing, and you have got full flexibility. Okay. So you design your sites, but what happens during the design of your site, when you start to design capacity sites, then what happens? These base station, what it will do, they are going to overreach. For example, if you see the coverage of the base station overreaches and hits the other base station. So there will be a cell overlap in between. You can't avoid it. You try your level best to down tilt the antenna to as much as possible, but there will always be cell overlap. Now, these cell overlap interferences, these are actually interferences which are causing to the mobile. For example, let's say I'll show you in the next diagram. Let's say if the mobile is sitting here at the edge of the cell, which is overlapping with the other cell, this mobile will have a hard time to decide which cell to lock in. Because this is an overlap area, you can't prevent it because it is impossible to configure a network which will have a coverage as if that the coverage stops at this particular point and the next coverage immediately start of the base station. It does not happen. So what happens is, in a situation like this, the network acts in an integrated, holistic manner to decide which mobile to be served with which base station. And that information and that kind of decision, the base station, the network will make. Network means a set of base stations. That is called network. It will make based on the information of signal quality, signal to noise ratio, which will be sent by the handset to the nearby base station, saying that, look, I am receiving this kind of signal from this base station, and this base station, this signal I am receiving. So the network will decide, okay, now you will be served by this base station depending upon the signal quality. So this is the licensed network. This is how you harness maximum capacity of a given quantum of spectrum, which is given, which has been auctioned to you or you are paid for it, right? You have got full flexibility. And why you use licensed spectrum? Because when you are licensed spectrum, you are given licensed spectrum, then what happens is that the network belongs to you. It is like a land, like if you like a private land, and you can construct your property based on whatever you want to a maximum flexibility to fully monetize this land, right? So that is licensed spectrum. Now come to unlicensed spectrum. And what is the purpose of unlicensed spectrum? I have already explained to you what is the purpose of licensed spectrum, because licensed spectrum means harness the full capacity of the spectrum based on your business requirement and demographic. Unlicensed spectrum has got a different objective altogether. These are spectrum for common man. Why? Because common man also needs spectrum. Why he needs spectrum? Because he may have some equipment in his house. You know that. There is no need for me to draw a diagram on this. You have a computer, you have a TV, you have some washing machine. Everything has to talk to each other or to the network, to the connect to the internet. For that, you can't go to the operator. If you go to the operator is going to charge you for your washing machine, for your fridge, for your TV, everything. then you will be bankrupt. You have to pay so much amount of money to the operator. So in order for that flexibility to the user to able to connect devices, they are given unlicensed spectrum. And unlicensed spectrum is given with a objective that people can use a common land like a public park based on certain rules. You have to follow rules. Here, you don't have to follow rules in licensed spectrum. Only rules that you have to follow is that the base station power should be enough so that it does not cause harm to the body. The cell phone power should be enough that it should not cause harm to when you are putting the phone in your ear, it should not be harming your brain, etc. That those are regulation to prevent human harm. So power limits are, kind of restricted because of that. And there will be a third requirement that nobody should spill over. When your power level should not be such that you are spilling to a neighboring band, right? You should not be able to cause interference. So these are the three reasons. Whereas in case of unlicensed spectrum, what happens? Because it is a public park, in public park, you cannot have a free will to do whatever you want. You cannot say that I'm going to create a hut here and start living here. You cannot do that, right? Public park is for common use. Everybody can come in and sit in a bench, but he has to follow rules. He cannot shout at the top of the voice and disturb others, right? So, because of this requirement that people should have their own spectrum for their own use in a collaborative fashion, you are given unlicensed spectrum, and therefore unlicensed spectrum is used. The power levels of devices in unlicensed spectrum, like the Wi-Fi router and the devices, are configured in such a way that they don't cause disturbance to your neighbor. Means you cannot be playing a full-fledged music system sitting here and your neighbor is going to have a hard time reading a book. You understand what I'm saying? So that is why the power levels are restricted with an intention that if there is a Wi-Fi router here and there is another Wi-Fi router here, their coverages are overlapping here. You can see this red coverage is this, and this is the the green coverage. They are overlapping with each other, so they should not interfere with each other, right? Now, in realistic sense, there will always be interference because you can have these two Wi-Fi routers sitting near to each other at a distance of 1 meter. So if there is going to be interference, even though you reduce the power level to such a lower level so that you can't cause too much interference, how do you mitigate such interference? Because interference will be there because the Wi-Fi routers, distance between two Wi-Fi routers is not regulated. You cannot say, it's not like that, you're going to put one Wi-Fi router, there has to be a distance of 100 meters before you can put two router. You can have your Airtel Wi-Fi router, a Jio Wi-Fi router sitting side by side. So in order to prevent such kind of interference of overlapping coverage between two Wi-Fi router, Wi-Fi technology has evolved a method that is called frequency hopping, which means, let me make you understand so that you can very clearly understand what I'm saying. So this is a full block of spectrum. You saw it in case of IMT spectrum also. IMT guys are using this full block of spectrum, right? Now, in case of unlicensed spectrum, this full block of spectrum has been given. But at a time, only 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/5 of the spectrum can be used by one particular user, depending upon whether that channel size, because this spectrum will be broken into channel size of various 20 megahertz, 40 megahertz, 80 megahertz, 160 megahertz, 320 megahertz. So you will pick a particular channel size depending upon whether that channel size is relatively free from interference. And that's how you mitigate the interference between two different routers. So if somebody tells you, oh, I have given you 500 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum, so you will have 500 megahertz of capacity, you tell him that it is never going to be 500 megahertz because at a time you will maybe using 20 megahertz, 40 megahertz, 60 megahertz, 80 megahertz, 160 megahertz or 320. Depending upon your channel size, you will be able to drive capacity. You understand? Another problem is capacity is going to exponentially fall, means your speeds are going to exponentially fall the distance between the router and your device, because the router is transmitting is a very, very low power compared to a base station. So if you are far away, let's say if you have a computer here, sitting here, and the computer is at a distance, let's say of, or maybe 1 meter or 2 meter or even 3 meter, you will find that if your computer was close to the router, just, attaching the router, almost like they're sticking with each other, that speed versus the speed that you get when you are far away from the router by around 5 meters, that will be exponentially low. Because of that, that's why you have to drive huge speeds here in order to get a reasonable speed here. This does not happen in case of a conventional license spectrum, where though at the edge of the cell the speed will reduce, but it is not going to reduce to a level as it gets reduced in case of a unlicensed spectrum, because the starting power here is very, very low because of the power restriction. And that's why this problem you are going to face. So unlicensed spectrum is an uncoordinated spectrum where the regulator is going to define what? Power levels, depending upon what kind of usages are required. Sometimes the power levels are pretty low, sometimes the power levels have been put a little bit higher, sometimes it is maybe very, very high. Different types of power levels are set depend on different consideration, because this unlicensed band, which is 2 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz, is also shared with Department of Space and backhaul, and there are other services. But licensed spectrums typically cleared of these services. There could be some service, but mostly it is cleared of these services. And then the next thing is the protocol, the Wi-Fi protocol, which does frequency hopping so as to prevent the full block of spectrum to be used simultaneously, only picking a particular slot which is reasonably free. You understand now? And that is why unlicensed spectrum is called a public park, where there could be many, many interference taking place parallel with each other, but you have to manage the interference in such a way that you are able to utilize this park without any kind of constraint or huge constraint. There will be constraint, but you can use this, right, as a public property. Now you get it? Now let's come to the satellite part of the discussion, which I haven't drawn any slide for it, but I'll explain to you in a very simple term that why satellite spectrum, though it is licensed spectrum, it is still not being auctioned, which I have done many videos in past. But this video I'm going to explain because this is an integrated video. You'll understand the whole concept very clearly. Now what happened? Assume that this is a license band. Okay. This is a satellite band. It is a license band and it is not getting auctioned. Now what does it mean? It is not getting auctioned. Auction means one individual person, full block of spectrum, this block of spectrum, which may be 10 megahertz, 20 megahertz, and this is a band which may be 100 megahertz. So you give one slot of 20 megahertz to one guy, right? That's how it is, right? So that 20 megahertz of spectrum is being utilized by these base stations, which are deployed on ground, correct? So that's the maximum spectrum he has, and he will be able to put as many base stations depending upon his demographic, which I have explained to you. Now, friends, the problem with satellite is, though it is licensed spectrum, difficulty is the following. Let's say if you have a 1 gigahertz of block of spectrum in a particular band. Now, if you slice this 1 gigahertz of spectrum, let's say with 100 megahertz each, and say that I am going to give this 100 megahertz each to n individual satellite players, auction it. Okay, break it into 10 pieces, let's say, or maybe 4 pieces. I'm just making it up. Okay. The problem will be that in case of terrestrial, the flexibility that you have to put n number of base station is so high that you will be able to fully harness this 100 megahertz or whatever the quantum of spectrum is, which is given to a license operator. Fully you can harness it to a maximum possible capability, right? Full juice of the spectrum you can extract, because you can put these base station at your leisure. You can have some constraint here and there, but the flexibility is pretty high. But look at the satellite player. The satellite player let's assume that these are satellites which are hanging in the sky. Okay. Now these satellites are driven by more regulation than the base stations on ground. For example, these satellites are going to be driven by orbital slots, which are not plenty. There will be frequencies which will be assigned which are not plenty. So the density of these satellites over a geographical area like India, right? Imagine Starlink. I gave you one of my video. I told you 40 satellites at a time, right? Visible from the surface of India. How many base stations we have in India total? More than 30 lakhs, right? 30 lakh base station we have in India versus 40 satellites, which means that if one block of spectrum of 100 megahertz is given to a satellite player and he has just 40 satellite, how will he be able to utilize the full capacity of that spectrum, friends? You can't, right? So his throughput is going to go down and his spectrum is going to lie waste because it is not going to be get fully utilized if exclusive assignment is made to the satellite player. And that's why this full block of spectrum of, let's say, 1 gigahertz is given to multiple satellite players at the same time so that they can coordinate with each other in case there is a conflict where two satellites signals, RF signals, collide with each other. But since the density of satellites are so low, that collision is not going to happen all the time. Even if there is a collision of RF signal, that will be for a brief period of time. So that is why satellite spectrum, though it is licensed spectrum, can't be auctioned because it can't be given exclusively. There will be wastage of spectrum, friends. You understand what I'm saying? Wastage of capacity. They can't harness the full capacity of satellite because they don't have the flexibility of putting so many base stations on ground. Do you understand now why satellite spectrum can't be auctioned? Now you can understand that what kind of campaign which are done to mislead the population. How simple it is when I explain to you, right? But you might be totally confused because the vested interest will keep running their campaign, right? Now you tell me why Deva's spectrum became a controversy. It was also satellite spectrum. Why it said that the satellite spectrum it should have been auctioned? Because I'm not going to go into detail. Devas actually wanted to use that band terrestrially at the garb of the satellite spectrum, 2.3 gigahertz band. It was for a terrestrial spectrum, 2.5 gigahertz band. It is a terrestrial band plus a satellite band. So they wanted to grab that spectrum as a satellite spectrum, but use it terrestrially. You understand? But these people are not going to use that spectrum terrestrially because it's a high frequency band, Starlink. They can't deploy. Imagine the operator holding 26 gigahertz band spectrum. They can't even deploy one single base station. That spectrum will lying waste. So they can't harness that spectrum capability on ground. And therefore, there is no way they can put base stations on ground. It has to be used by satellite. So that's all, friends, in this video. Otherwise, this will go too long. It's already 23 minutes. I think you might have understood the concept clearly as I could have done. I don't know whether I'm successful or not. But thanks for listening till the end. I'll come back with a new video and a new topic next time. Thank you very much, friends.